All right, so if we remember that we always have to factor out an I before we do anything else when we have a negative number under of our radicals, then we can go ahead and we can simplify radicals that have negative values underneath the radical. So in our first example here, we have the square root of negative 64. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this negative right there. I need to factor that out first. So I'm going to factor, when it comes out in front, it factors out as an I. So when I factor that out, now what's left under the radical, I can make positive. So I times the square root of 64. Okay, well, I know that 64 is 8 squared. And so the square and the square root, they undo each other. And I can write this as 8 times I as my solution. So just for consistency's sake, we will always write the real number, okay, in front, and I will go behind it, much like we do with a variable, okay? So going on to our next one, we have the square root of negative 50. Again, I have a negative under my radical. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor that out as I. And then that turns my radical into a positive number underneath, the square root of 50. That is something that I can then go ahead and simplify. So I have I times the square root of, well, 50 is 25 times 2. Okay. 25 I know is a perfect square, so that means that the 5 can come out because it's 5 squared. So that's going to give me 5I times the square root of 2 as my solution there. Okay. And in this one, we always like to put our radicals as far at the end as possible. And that's so that there's no confusion about what's underneath the radical versus what's being multiplied outside. Okay. So we like to put things that are multiplied by the radical out in front and then put the radical last. All right. Now then, for this last example here, okay, I have the square root of negative 5 times the square root of negative 5. So keep in mind, I have those negatives, okay? And as I said before, you need to factor those out first before we do anything else. So this is going to be, oops, I can't use the highlighter to do this. So this is going to be I times the square root of 5. Okay. And that's going to be multiplied by, again, I times the square root of 5. Okay. So remember, things outside the radical get multiplied together. So I times I is I squared. And then things under the radical get multiplied together. So this would be times the square root of 5 times 5. I'll just write it as 5 squared. Okay. Remember that I squared, okay, that here I squared is equal to negative 1. So I can replace the I squared with a negative, and then the square root of 5 squared, those undo each other, and I get negative 5 as my answer. Now, this makes sense, hopefully, okay, that since I have negative 5 under the radical, that it would be my answer. The thing you don't want to do, okay, so I'm going to write down, don't do this. Okay, you don't want to do the multiplication first. Right, because I have the square root of negative 5 times the square root of negative 5. If I were to do the multiplication first, right, and so I would have negative 5 times negative 5 here, okay, well, when I multiply those together, I get the square root of 25, and the square root of 25 is 5. But this is not the correct answer. Okay. So you need to make sure that we never want to show a radical or work with a radical that has a negative underneath it. That's why we pull the I out first, okay? Once we've gone ahead and pulled the negative out in front as an I, then we can go ahead and we can start manipulating our radicals like we're used to by multiplying things together, simplifying and things like that. But you have to factor out the I first before you do absolutely anything else. Okay, so now when we take a look at this example here, okay, so the square root of negative 36 over the square root of negative 9. Okay, again, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out that negative as an I. So I'm going to have an I on the top and an I on the bottom, and that's going to be multiplied by the square root of 36 over the square root of 9. Okay, now notice that, okay, I have an I in the numerator and an I in the denominator. Just like with any other numbers, if it shows up on the top and the bottom, I can go ahead and I can cancel them out. The square root of 36 is 6. The square root of 9 is 3. So my solution to this problem is simply 2. All right. And then lastly, we have an example here. I have the square root of negative 15 times the square root of negative 6. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to factor out the negatives under the radical as i's. Okay. So, let's see here. So I'm going to have I times the square root of 15, and that's going to be multiplied by I times the square root of 6. And for problems like these, things outside the radical will get multiplied together. So I take the I times I, that gives me I squared. And then I can take the 15 times 6, and that's going to give me 90. Okay? And remember, I squared is equal to negative 1. So this is negative 1 times the square root of, well, 90 is going to be 9 times 10. Okay? And the square root of 9 is 3, so this will be negative 3 times the square root of 10 as my simplified answer to this problem.